Hi everyone, it's James here again for another episode of Biome Bites. We actually just recorded this whole episode, and then at the very end I realised that the microphone wasn't on. So, take two. Hopefully it's really good. What we're talking about today is microbiome myths and misconceptions. And we're going to talk about three. And the thinking behind this podcast is there's this lovely article written by Professor Alan Walker, who's been on the podcast. Highly recommend you watch and listen to that episode, and Professor Leslie Hoyles. And it's in Nature Microbiology, so a really nice, high-impact scientific journal. And they go through a lot of the things which you hear within this space, be it in social media, be it in when you're speaking to someone who's just generally taking an interest in the microbiome. Even in scientific papers, this still comes up, even though it's been refuted and proven to be untrue. So we're going to arm you as the listeners to Inside Matters with this knowledge so that you can truly start to become an expert and you've got your finger on the pulse of the field. And if you hear it, you go, actually, I heard in Inside Matters that that's not true. So the first one is the human microbiota weighs 1 to 2 kg. Hear this a lot, several kilograms, almost like a weight plate at the gym. Wow, that's a lot. Now, although it's mentioned many times in literature, although you hear people talking about it, people say it weighs as much as a grapefruit. And what the professors do in their papers, they explain that the majority of the microorganisms reside within the colon, i.e. the large intestine. And if you've listened to the previous Biome Bites episode, we walk through the digestive tract, the gut, what the gut is, what the digestive system is, and how it all links together and how the microbiota fits within all of that. And in that episode, if you've not listened to it, what we say is that the vast majority of the microbiota, i.e. the microorganisms, particularly bacteria, that reside within the body live in the large intestine. And what's interesting is when you take a stool sample, or we can just use the other word, a poo, the microorganisms typically account for roughly 50% of the weight of the fecal solid mass. And this has been published, but also we've done a lot of stool collection and stool analysis at Enterobiotics. In fact, it's quite possible that we collect more stool on a regular basis and analyze stool in a more in-depth manner than anyone else in the world at the moment. So we know a fair bit about how stool size, shape, mass, composition changes within a particular person, but also across different people. Now, in the paper, they say that the average human stool weighs less than 200 grams of wet weight. Our experience shows that it varies very, very significantly, but that's probably a true statement. And when you're running a donor program like at Enterobiotics, you actually want to target people who donate larger amounts, but also who have a good ratio of microorganisms versus solids. And that's driven by fiber and fiber content. Now, they cite a really interesting paper in patients or people, unfortunately, who have had a sudden death. And in the sudden death, people, as part of a kind of post-mortem, they've assessed what the total colonic contents are, so the total contents of the large intestine, and the study cited a range of 83 to 421 grams. So what the authors conclude is that in the absence of, in rare cases where someone is severely constipated with a very large amount of compacted fecal matter in their colons, the total weight of the human microbiota is more likely to be less than 500 grams rather than 1 to 2 kilograms. And that's based on the average weight of human stool and the study that shows that, the average mass of fecal contents is between 83 and 420 grams. So there you go. If someone says there's 1 to 2 kilograms of microorganisms that live on and inside of your body, you can counter and say, actually, it's more like half a kilogram. But still, that's a lot. That's a lot of microorganisms. Now, in keeping with this theme of numbers of microorganisms, the one that I hear the most, and the one that's probably most pervasive in the human microbiome literature and across influencers and the social media people, there are gut health influencers now. Gut health is everywhere. And there's a lot of really bad, wrong information. It's just incorrect and untrue. I see people recommending various different protocols, people citing facts which are not actually even facts. And this is the one that probably comes up the most. And you're going to know now, if you see this, that the source is not truly up to speed with the literature and they've not really done their homework or done their reading. So this one is that the number of microorganisms that live on and inside of your body outnumber the human cells by 10 to 1. Heard it a lot. I said it for quite a long time. But several years ago, I realized that this was actually wrong. And it's been shown to be wrong in the literature many, many times. But we still use it, probably because it's kind of cool. And you can say, well, you're more microbial than human. 10 times as many, that's a big number. Now, apparently this originated in 1970 or in the 1970s on the back of an envelope. It wasn't some super detailed calculation on a spreadsheet. It was on an envelope. It wasn't backed up by lots of wet research and scientific logs and books. It's just back of an envelope. And since then, there's been a lot more detailed analysis. And the true figure is probably more like 1 to 1. Now, that's still really impressive. That is a lot of microorganisms. And the interesting thing is, just to bring it back to the last point about the number of microorganisms in a stool sample, whether you're more microbial than human or more human than microbial, based on the numbers of microbial cells on and inside of you versus your human cells, depends on perhaps when you've been to the toilet. Because if 50% of your stool, which is a sum product of the colonic contents, is microorganism, then if you've just been to the loo, you may be more human than microbial and vice versa. So a bit of trivia there for you. The other point to note, which is highlighted in the paper, is that it probably varies as well depending on where in the world you are. So if you're in a hyper clean environment, you have less than someone who's living in an environment where there's no soap and no antibiotics, like somebody in the jungle somewhere. So pretty interesting stuff. Now, the last one then is that the microbiota is inherited from the mother at birth. And you hear this one a lot, and it usually ties into how someone's been born. So people say things like, well, if you've been born by C-section, you're more likely to have autism, or you're more likely to have metabolic syndrome, you're more likely to be obese, all of which are potentially true based on population-based studies, i.e. they take large cohorts of people who have something, in the case autism, metabolic syndrome, obesity, and they ask the question, how were you born? And if more people cluster towards a particular birth method, then when you take a healthy control group, then it's likely that, or it's possible that, rather than likely, depending on the size of the study, that this particular factor contributes to the development of the disease or the syndrome or whatever we're talking about here. And the more this is replicated in different parts, the larger the sample size, the more robust it is. And there have been very large population studies where we've looked at the association between how you've been born and the development of obesity, autism, certain things like that. And it's true that there are correlations, for sure, but it doesn't necessarily mean causation. It's still interesting, though. Bringing it back to this particular point, in terms of the microbiota being inherited from the mother, the other point to this is that if you're being born through the normal route, then the first microorganisms that you come into contact to, the normal being through the vagina, are the microorganisms of your mother in the vaginal tract, the kind of natural way. And the alternative approach is if you're born through a C-section, then the first microorganisms you come into contact with are the microorganisms from the skin, microorganisms from the surgical room. Some of these are multi-drug resistant, and they're not ones that you would typically expect to find within the intestinal tract. That said, it's not the case that they stay there forever guaranteed. And the most important years of life are the early years of life, particularly when you've weaned off breast milk or however you've been fed at the time, to more solid foods. And there's a dramatic increase in the diversity of the microbiota over the first couple of years. And I could point you in the direction of a really nice book called Dark Matter by someone called Dr. James McIlroy, who I hope to have on the podcast, where he talks about just how important those formative years actually are. That said, every adult ends up with a very unique microbiota composition. It's as unique as a fingerprint. How do we know that? Well, we can assess the microbiome in identical twins who have exactly the same genotype, who've been in the same house, sometimes most of their life, or certainly up until the point of testing, and they have distinct microbiotas. So it's the sum of everything you've eaten and everything you've done up until the point of testing. And there can be dramatic changes, but as you get older, it starts to get a bit more stable. So although microbiota assembly from birth is not yet fully understood, we do think that the adult communities are predominantly shaped by the early year lives and factors such as diet, antibiotic therapy, host genetics, rather than just being purely inheritance from the mother. So there's 3 microbiome myths and misconceptions debunked. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you so much for supporting the podcast, for taking an interest in your gut health and your microbiome. I'm open to feedback, and we do like the 5-star reviews. Please keep them coming because it lifts and elevates the podcast across all the channels.